If you encounter that one person who says they don't need reparations for being enslaved, agree with them. And my auntie say, agree with your adversaries quickly. Agree quickly. Say, okay. And then you tell them, you say, you know, there was a period of Reconstruction shortly after the Civil War ended, where black folks started to create schools and institutions like Howard University, HU, like Howard University and Hampton University, and they started to create financial institutions, and marriages became legal. They started to get married and things like that, but then there was an agreement made in Congress in order for Rutherford B. Hayes to become president that they would remove the Union troops out of the South so that the South could then reign in terror against the black people who had just made all of this progress. And so then if they say, hey, they don't deserve reparations for enslavement, say, what about for the retribution that happened after Reconstruction? Where all and a lot of the progress that was made by the Freedmen's Bureau and all of those other institutions and organizations, what about all of the retribution that was wreaked on them and the communities after the period of Reconstruction? What about reparations for that? Then maybe they'll say, no, they don't deserve reparations for that. And you say, oh, okay. Well, in 1919, black women in particular, God bless black women, fought to make sure that women had the right to vote during the women's suffrage movement. Even it became a caste system, and white women didn't want black women to get the access to vote, even though black women like Ida B. Wells and so many others fought in order for suffrage to happen. Black men had the opportunity to vote, but many of them were being terrorized. Many of them were being killed even for advocating for voting, especially for organizing people to go and vote. You remember the Red Summer of 1919. You remember even though black people were fighting for this country in other parts of the world, in World War I, they would come back to this country and be mistreated and degraded. You say, what about some reparations for that? We didn't give black women the right to vote. We didn't treat black folks well during that period. There was lynchings going on, and many communities were rising against black people in particular after we left the South. And they say, what about that? They'd be like, no, we don't. They don't deserve reparations. You say, well, friend, okay, let's go. Let's just move forward and say, well, black folks fought in World War II, right? And they fought in order to preserve democracy. They fought against Hitler. They fought alongside all these other troops. They gave their lives. They gave all that they could for the beliefs and the ideals of this country. They came back to the United States of America, and even in their own uniforms, they got beaten. Even in their own uniforms, they were called the N-word. Even in their own uniforms, they couldn't sit next to us in lunch counters. They had to have a green book to find places that they could go in order to eat with their families. They had to do all these things just to try and survive. They were denied resources that other white folks were given. Hold on, like home loans, like the GI Bill and things that folks got in the Vietnam War. All these things they were denied access to. Certainly, they get reparation for that. And your friend, they might be like, nah. They don't deserve reparation for that. And then you say, well, wait a second. Over 4,000 black people were lynched. Thousands of black men and black women were lynched. That we didn't pass the Emmett Till lynching law until just a couple of years ago in the 21st century. We had Mary Turner who was advocating about the lynching of John Turner the day before. They lynched her husband. Then she advocated about the lynching and said that was wrong, that was unjust, that was immoral. And then they cut Mary Turner open and killed the baby that was inside of her womb. They said, certainly for the violence that we wreaked on black communities and the trauma and the terrorism that was committed by people who were even having badges of the police, we deserve to give reparation for that. And they might say what? They might say no. You just look at them and you say, friend, okay. In the 1970s, we launched a war against black folk. We took crack cocaine from these seeds in a different country. And we put them in Los Angeles. And we put them in all the black communities. And we decided that if you had crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, you would go to jail for longer because black folks used crack cocaine and white folks used powder cocaine. And we ensured that they would stay in jail longer. And we proliferated their communities. And so many of them died. And so many of them became addicts. And so many of them were sick. And so many of them had miscarriages. And so many of them were hurt and harmed by this crack epidemic that was actually created by the President of the United States and was supported by the institutions of American government. I mean, certainly there's reparation for that, and they'll look at you and they'll say no, they don't even deserve reparation for that. And you'll say, okay, let's look at housing. We redlined them. We told them there were only certain places that they could live, and then we polluted those very places, and so they die more than white folks die. They don't have wealth the way that white folks have been able to have 10 times the more wealth. And you can say, surely there's some reparation for that, and they'll look at you and they'll say no. You say, okay, well, look, just move forward with me. That was too far, right? You know, you've heard this argument. That's too far long ago. I wasn't around then. I didn't have anything to do with that. I didn't enslave anybody. I didn't lynch anybody. I didn't put crack in anybody's neighborhood. And you say, well, but you were a beneficiary. But you say, okay, I got you. And then you move forward and you say, in 1990s, the president and the entire Congress and the entire country were calling black people super predators. They were locking up people left and right, and led to the mass incarceration movement that now has 2 million people incarcerated. Up 30% more, over 300% more than in the 1970s. Wealth gone from their family for generations. Breaking and shattering communities beyond any recognition. Certainly, there's some reparation for that. They'll look at you. They'll say no. And you say, there's this gun violence epidemic that's killing more of them today. You say the educational system, it's unfair to them. They have more debt. They're not even allowed to get into school. 80% of black folks aren't even being able to get access to higher education. You look at them puzzled. You say, but you have a home that you live in that was your grandparents, because they got and were beneficiaries of the GI Bill. You say you inherited that. What were black folks? What did they inherit from this country? Despite all they have done, what have black folks inherited? Without black Americans, there is no America. Without the blood, thank you, it's the truth. Without the blood and the sacrifice of black Americans, there is no America. Anytime this country has moved closer toward democracy, anytime it's moved closer toward the promises of liberty and justice for all, it's because we died for it. 1863, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation not because he wanted to free enslaved people. He said himself, I went to the Lincoln Memorial together just last week. He said himself, if I could free no enslaved person and save the Union, I'd do it. He said, I got to sign this because if black folk don't fight, we lose this country. If black folks don't fight, we lose the Union. And in return, black Americans get a white lash. In return, we get an attack on wokeness, an attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion. In return, we get a society hell-bent on saying we didn't do anything. And still, we persist. Still, we run for office and swear our hands on a Bible and on an oath of a Constitution saying these promises are possible. And so the call and the need for reparations, the need for repairing the harm is because our country has yet to recognize and acknowledge the horror and the terror and the theft that it contributed and the pain that it contributed that lives in our very bodies. And by failing to acknowledge the pain and the trauma of the worst atrocity known in human history, which is the transatlantic slave trade in the United States of America and across the world, Brazil had 4 million enslaved people. The wealth built in New York and in Boston and in so many parts of our country, and those are places in the north. You see that? Mm-hmm. The wealth built in New York and Boston came from the slave trade. Came from our bodies and our blood. And by failing to even acknowledge and recognize it, it is failing to acknowledge and recognize the vestiges today. The loophole of the 13th Amendment that helped to fuel the mass incarceration movement. By failing to acknowledge it, we fail to acknowledge it, the reality of what we are still experiencing. And so the reason that I am for reparation and repairing the harm is because America owes her people